November 1944. The cold late autumn winds swept across the Iowa plains, carrying the scent of damp earth, rotting fallen leaves, and a biting chill that slowed every step. Nestled among rows of gray brick buildings, barbed wire fences, and silent watchtowers, Fort Des Moines prison camp was preparing for a strange holiday. None of the American guards that day realized they were writing a unique chapter in history. For the first time ever, 63 German female prisoners, their enemies, would sit down to celebrate Thanksgiving right on American soil. A foreign tradition with unfamiliar food, it would become a cultural shock that neither side would ever forget. Inside women's cell block number 3, Frida Hartmann, 29, sat cross-armed on her iron bed. The woman from Hamburg had once been a logistics officer in the German army, in charge of distributing food to an entire division. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back, her eyes cold and sharp. Frida carried with her an almost unshakable belief in the SI stem she had once served. She knew exactly how much German soldiers' rations had been reduced, from 2,000 calories per day to just over 1,000. She was also the one who had signed the order to replace real coffee with acorn coffee, a bitter, nutrition-poor drink. In Frida's mind, America, the enemy across the ocean, must surely have been suffering just as badly. She had heard it repeated endlessly in Third Reich propaganda. Americans are savages. They starve their prisoners. They are far weaker than us. But in just a few hours, that belief would be shattered by something almost unbelievably simple. A turkey. Rumors about a Thanksgiving spread through the prison barracks faster than any official bulletin. A few young women whispered, "They say there will be turkey. What kind of animal is that? It's just chicken, right? A joke maybe. The Americans are going to feed us well? Impossible." The whispers blended with the sound of wind whistling past the narrow window frames. To many prisoners, Thanksgiving sounded like just another piece of propaganda theater, like the mandatory film screenings from the German propaganda ministry. But for Frida, what puzzled her wasn't the meaning of the holiday, it was the logistics. How could a country engaged in total war possibly have enough surplus to throw a feast, even for prisoners? At the same time, in the command office, Captain Helen Morrison was signing the last of the distribution slips. The American woman, nearly 40, was well known in the military for her discipline and directness. To her, Thanksgiving wasn't just a day off. It was a symbol of American democracy, gratitude, abundance, and the tradition of sharing. Morrison had fiercely argued with her superiors to secure extra food for the feast. Some objected, saying, "Why feed prisoners well? It's a waste." But she stood firm. "We don't win just with guns. We win by proving that our system can feed everyone, even the enemy." The logistics woman and the seed of doubt. On the night before Thanksgiving, Frida was assigned to the kitchen. She stepped through the heavy wooden door, where the warmth of the ovens carried the scent of butter, flour, and rich, fatty meat. Before her lay a surreal scene. Mountains of potatoes piled high, bags of white sugar and flour, enough to feed an entire German battalion for weeks. And most striking of all, more than 24 massive turkeys, each weighing up to 20 pounds, waiting to be prepared. Frida froze. She instinctively started calculating calories, rations, days of feeding troops. The numbers spun wildly in her mind. If they can spare this much for prisoners, then what are their soldiers out there eating? A voice rang out in English with a Boston accent. "You'll help me with the turkeys." The speaker was Staff Sergeant Patricia O'Sullivan, head cook. Round-faced, gentle smile, quick hands. Patricia looked at Frida not like an enemy, but like a young woman far from home, just needing something to keep herself busy. Frida touched the cold body of a turkey, her palms trembling slightly. In her life, she had only ever seen chicken or goose, both now luxuries in Germany. These birds in front of her were so large it felt absurd. That night, back in the cell, while the other female prisoners gossiped about what kind of farce might unfold the next day, Frida whispered a sentence in German. "Ist das wirklich Truthahn?" Is this really turkey? A question that sounded almost innocent, yet carried a deep-rooted doubt. Could a nation waging war across the globe truly afford such abundance? That question would echo throughout her life, marking the beginning of a transformation. From a cold Nazi logistics officer to a living witness of the truth that war is not only decided by bullets, but by the ability to feed people. To understand why a turkey could shake Frida so deeply, we must go back in time to Hamburg, where her childhood and her career in logistics were etched by hunger and deprivation. Frida Hartmann was born in 1915 in Hamburg, a bustling port city of Germany. Her father was a dock worker, her mother a seamstress. Frida's childhood wasn't wealthy, but it wasn't miserable either. She remembered mornings with thick slices of buttered bread, rich aromatic coffee, and the long whistle of ships echoing from the Elbe port. But those memories were swept away by war. Hamburg became one of the most heavily bombed targets during Operation Gomorrah in 1943. On those nights of falling bombs, the city turned into a sea of fire. Frida watched with her own eyes as the street where she grew up collapsed after just a few bombing runs. From then on, she built a steel shell around herself, the hardness of someone who had seen her hometown reduced to ashes. Unlike many German women of her time, who were forced into domestic roles or propaganda work, Frida had a unique gift: numbers. From a young age, she could calculate quickly in her head, memorize figures, and organize information efficiently. When she joined the military, that talent kept her off the battlefield and placed her in logistics, where rations, fuel, and everything needed to sustain an army were calculated. Her official title was Hauptfeldwebel, Logistics Sergeant, but in reality, she held far more power. With just a few figures in Frida's notebook, an entire unit could be well fed or have their rations cut in half. In 1942, Frida wrote a blunt report to her superiors. "If we continue distributing at the current rate, we will face starvation within 18 months. The report was dismissed. But to Frida, what she had predicted was already beginning to unfold. Every day, Frida had to confront harsh numbers. Meat, reduced from 500 grams per person per week to less than 200. Butter, almost disappeared, replaced by artificial fats. Coffee, replaced by muckafuck, a thick black liquid brewed from roasted acorns. She never forgot one inspection at a field kitchen in eastern France. A pot of watery soup with only a few scraps of turnip and rotting potato floating on top. A soldier held his spoon and gave a bitter smile. "This is our Christmas feast, Sergeant." Frida didn't smile. She took notes, did the math, then silently added a new line to the distribution list. Cut an additional 10%. She knew it was the only way to prolong survival for the unit. But every time she signed her name, she felt as though she was taking a piece of life away from the men in front of her. In war, Frida didn't carry a gun, didn't kill, but she knew death came in another form, an empty stomach. Soldiers without sugar reduced combat effectiveness. Soldiers without protein, vulnerable to illness. Soldiers without rest, mental collapse. Frida was more obsessed with the concept of calories than with any slogan from German propaganda. To her, the war wasn't decided only by generals or weapons, but by the ability to get enough food into soldiers' mouths. While Frida recorded every gram of food, German radio continued to broadcast bold reports. The Americans are starving. Britain is exhausted. They can't sustain the war longer than we can. She wanted to believe. She had to believe, because if not, every number she recorded would become a death sentence for her homeland. She reassured herself. We're suffering, but the enemy must be exhausted too. Maybe even worse. But then, after being captured in Italy and transported to the US, that belief began to waver. The train carrying the prisoners passed through America's vast fields. Corn, wheat, dairy cattle. Everything stretched endlessly to the horizon. Frida tried to shut her eyes, telling herself it was just an illusion. In her cell at Fort Des Moines, Frida often lay on the iron bed, clutching a small notebook. She kept up her old habit, recording numbers, how many prisoners, how many rations, how much flour was distributed each week. Those small figures gave her a sense of control. When news of a Thanksgiving reached her, she scoffed. A holiday to give thanks, while all of Europe was starving? To Frida, it could only be a farce. But her professional curiosity wouldn't let her sit still. She told herself, if they're really throwing a feast, I'll observe. I have to know where the supplies are coming from, and how many combat rations the food would equal. In her mind, Thanksgiving wasn't a cultural celebration. It was a logistics test. On the night of November 22nd, 1944, Frida barely slept. She recalled every scene of deprivation she had ever witnessed. A child in Hamburg, skin and bones, clutching a piece of dry bread like a treasure. A soldier shivering with fever, holding a cup of watery acorn coffee. Mothers standing in long lines to trade ration coupons for a few potatoes. All those memories condensed into a single fear. If tomorrow the Americans truly served luxuries like turkey, butter, and sugar, then every belief she had clung to would collapse. Before drifting off, Frida told herself, I will prove it's all a staged performance. I'll uncover the deception behind that feast, because if I don't, everything I've ever believed in, everything I've ever done, will be meaningless. She had no idea that the feast would mark the beginning of a collapse, not just of a logistics officer's convictions, but of the proud image of Germany she carried in her heart. On the morning of November 23, 1944, the atmosphere at Fort Des Moines prison camp was unlike any other day. From early on, the camp kitchen roared to life. Warmth and the smell of butter spread down the hallways, slipping through iron doors, sparking murmurs among the prisoners. For the 63 German women, it was almost unbelievable. The enemy's kitchen was preparing something rich, fragrant, nothing like the usual watery soup or stale bread. Frida sat by the narrow cell window, her small notebook still in hand. Even with her stomach growling at the unfamiliar scent, she kept jotting down numbers by habit. Prisoner count, standard rations, estimated calories. But that smell kept intruding, breaking through her rigid calculations. It reminded her that the enemy's arithmetic might be larger than every subtraction she had ever marked down. Around 9 a.m., the guards called a group of prisoners to assist in the kitchen. Frida was among them. Stepping through the heavy wooden door, she felt like she had entered another world, warm, bright, and overflowing with supplies. Before her, mountains of potatoes rose in towering heaps. Sacks of flour and white sugar were stacked to the corner. But what stunned Frida speechless were the rows of wooden tables covered with over 24 enormous turkeys, each one so heavy it took 2 people to lift, with pink-white skin and firm flesh, ready for a celebration. Frida inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself, but her logistical instincts immediately kicked in. She started calculating rations, calories, and how many German soldiers could be fed with this single stockpile. A voice cut through her thoughts, warm but firm. "You'll help me with the turkeys." Frida looked up. In front of her stood Staff Sergeant Patricia O'Sullivan, the head cook, a woman with calloused hands but kind, intelligent eyes. Patricia didn't look at Frida like an enemy. She looked at her like a stranger who just needed to learn how to hold a knife, how to forget. "He war." She handed Frida a knife and gestured toward the turkeys. Frida stepped forward, her hands trembling as she touched the cool flesh. In her memory, chicken or goose were luxuries, and the bird before her was so massive it felt like a cruel joke. She whispered in German, barely audible to herself, "Ist das wirklich Truthahn? Is this really turkey?" Patricia didn't understand the words, but saw the disbelief written clearly on Frida's face. She just smiled and began showing her how to clean, season, and stuff the birds. "This is how my family does it in Boston," she said, voice soft like she was passing down a cherished tradition. Frida watched every movement, not to learn how to cook, but to study something far more terrifying: abundance. When she saw Patricia mix in butter for the stuffing, an amount that could feed a German family for a month, Frida felt each knife stroke on the cutting board slicing through her carefully guarded illusions. Around her, the other women were just as stunned. Greta Hoffman, a communications officer from Berlin, whispered nervously to Frida, "If this is how they feed prisoners, what must their soldiers be eating?" Frida didn't answer. She simply stared at the turkeys being stuffed with bread, butter, and herbs. In her mind, the numbers rearranged into a mental comparison chart. U.S. supply chains versus Germany's. One side had endless stockpiles, the other had ration cards and watery soup. The result was too clear and too chilling. At that moment, Captain Helen Morrison entered to inspect the preparations. Her uniform crisp, her gaze sharp. She embodied military discipline, but also the determination to make this meal a statement. Morrison nodded approvingly at the progress, then turned to Patricia and said, "Make sure it's done right. This isn't just a meal. It's proof of our values." Frida overheard it, and her heart twisted. Morrison spoke in English, but every word pierced like a blade. Proof of values. Did they truly intend to use food to dismantle the enemy's beliefs? All morning, Frida worked like a machine, prepping, rinsing, stuffing, while her mind kept spinning. She realized that the calm efficiency of the American kitchen was more frightening than any weapon. No one here seemed concerned about supply shortages. No one counted grams or hoarded spoonfuls of butter. Everything flowed naturally, as if abundance needed no explanation. When the last of the turkeys went into the oven, the rich, buttery aroma filled every corner of the camp. Frida stepped back, her hands still greasy, and a truth rang out in her chest that she could no longer deny. This wasn't a performance. This was reality. In that instant, she recalled her 1942 report warning of looming famine. She had been right, but not right enough. Her mistake was believing that America would suffer the same fate. Now, looking into the glow of the oven and the golden brown turkeys inside, Frida realized the enemy possessed an invisible weapon. The ability to feed everyone, even those fighting against them. And that was the killing blow. On Thanksgiving morning, Fort Des Moines was filled with a rich, sweet aroma. Smoke from the ovens drifted all the way to the barbed wire fences, blending with Iowa's cold wind. For the German women prisoners, used to the smell of gasoline and rusted iron, it felt like stepping into another world, a world of roasted meat, melting butter, caramelized sugar, and spices they had long forgotten. Frida stood at the kitchen doorway, her once sharp logistics officer gaze now clouded with doubt and curiosity. She had seen the mountains of ingredients, touched the massive turkeys, heard the crackling skin crisp in the oven. But what stunned her most was the Americans' calm. No one measured grams of butter, no one saved a single potato. They worked as if their supplies were endless. At exactly 11 o'clock, the hall doors opened. Long tables were covered in pristine white cloths, decorated with yellow and orange maple leaves, baskets of corn, pumpkins, and wheat. On the walls hung hand-lettered signs in both English and German. Thanksgiving, a day of gratitude. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, the cultural officer, stepped up to the podium. Her clear voice rang out in perfect German, silencing the room. Today, Americans celebrate Thanksgiving. It began with the first settlers, who shared a meal with Native Americans to survive a harsh winter. Since then, every year we gather to remember that abundance must be shared, even with strangers. A wave of whispers swept through the prisoners. For women from a bomb-ravaged homeland, the idea of a holiday to celebrate surplus felt absurd. Frida listened, eyes half closed. In her mind, the words abundance and sharing clashed like a cruel paradox for Germany. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. From the kitchen, Patricia O'Sullivan and her team carried out trays of golden turkey. The skin glistened, crackled, and released clear, rich fat into the pans. The smell was overwhelming. Even the American guards licked their lips. P.S. Frida sat at the table beside Greta Hoffman and other prisoners. In front of her, a white porcelain plate was already set with gleaming silverware. She touched the cold fork. Her heart pounded like waiting for an artillery strike. Captain Morrison rose, scanning the hall. She spoke briefly and firmly. Then Sarah Chen translated. Today we celebrate not just because we are Americans, but because we are human. You are far from home, far from family, but today we sit together and share abundance. The final words struck Frida like sugar-coated bullets. Share abundance. In Hamburg, the city was starving. Here, the enemy handed a full plate to a prisoner. A thick slice of turkey, a mountain of mashed potatoes, golden butter, rich brown gravy, and a spoonful of deep red cranberry sauce were placed before her. Frida stared at the plate, her hands frozen. In her head, two opposing voices clashed. This is propaganda. Don't believe it. No, this is real. This is true power. Greta nudged her and whispered, "Eat. If this is what they give to prisoners, imagine their soldiers." Frida bit her lip, then picked up the knife and sliced the first piece of turkey. The meat was soft, pinkish white, juices spilling out. She brought it to her mouth. In that moment, the entire room fell silent, not with suspicion, but with shock. Frida chewed slowly, herbs and butter spreading across her tongue, rich, tender, completely unlike the tough meat and watery soup from the front. Her body trembled in response, a primal relief from months of hunger. Tears rose unexpectedly. She quickly looked down, pretending to focus on cutting the meat, but her hands were shaking. She realized she wasn't just eating turkey, she was swallowing the bitter truth. Germany had lost long ago because the enemy could feed even those who fought against them with leftover abundance. Patricia moved through the hall, spooning more food onto plates, when she added another slice of turkey to Frida's dish without waiting to be asked. Frida felt undone by that effortless generosity. This wasn't showmanship. It was the habit of a society that had never feared scarcity. All around, whispers escaped. They used real butter in the mashed potatoes. This cranberry sauce. Berlin doesn't even have potatoes right now. How can a staged performance be this much? Dr. James Peterson, the camp doctor, sat quietly in a corner, taking notes. He watched faces relax after the first bite, then pale as understanding sank in. He knew this meal had accomplished what months of interrogation could not, planting a cold despair, the truth that their war was already lost. Frida put down her knife and fork, resting her forehead in her palm. Her mind raced with calculations, calories, rations, cargo ships, farms. She didn't need another intelligence report. This one meal was enough to prove America could feed the world. Germany couldn't even feed itself. When the desserts came, pumpkin pie, apple pie, Frida only stared. She no longer needed to count. The numbers had already said everything. The sound of cutlery clinking against plates echoed softly, disjointed, hesitant, as if each metallic tap was a blow to the minds of the women seated around the long table. No one spoke much. They ate, but their eyes met, searching, waiting for someone to explain the absurdity. Why would the enemy serve a mountain of food while their homeland starved? Frida chewed slowly, each bite of tender turkey melting in her mouth. But her mind was a whirlwind of calculations. Each turkey weighed 20 pounds. The camp held over 60 prisoners. The meat alone surpassed the rations for an entire German battalion over several days. And that didn't include the mashed potatoes, bread, butter, cranberry sauce, or luxuries like white sugar and cream. She felt like she had been thrown into a vast laboratory where the enemy used food to prove a simple theorem. Abundance can crush belief. Greta Hoffman, seated beside her, leaned in and whispered, "This has to be propaganda. They're showing off to break out spirits." Frida didn't respond. Her eyes were on her plate, but her hands trembled. She knew Greta voiced what many others were thinking. But deep down, Frida knew the truth. Propaganda couldn't produce mountains of butter and sugar like she had seen in the kitchen. Propaganda didn't move American cooks to add extra turkey to a prisoner's plate without hesitation. This wasn't theater. It was habit. It was reality. A soft sob broke out at the end of the table. A young prisoner with tangled blonde hair held her face in her hands. Tears fell onto a plate of untouched food. She couldn't bear the contrast. Her mother in Berlin was probably sharing scraps of dry bread, while here she was offered seconds. Another sniffle followed. Then deep sighs spread across the room. Dr. James Peterson, the camp doctor, sat silently observing. In his notebook, he wrote, "Prisoners entering a state of strategic grief, a psychological collapse upon realizing all their sacrifices were meaningless in the face of undeniable reality." He knew he had just witnessed a kind of breakdown that bullets could never cause, the shattering of strategic belief. Captain Morrison stood at the head of the table, surveying the room. She didn't smile or gloat. Her expression was solemn, like someone who understood she had just ignited a different kind of war. A war of the mind. Morrison knew some higher-ups would criticize her for wasting food on prisoners. But here, in this moment, she saw clearly. The meal was more powerful than any interrogation. Frida set down her fork and knife, fingers tightly intertwined. In her mind, she began drafting a report. American supply capacity far exceeds all previous estimates. Prisoners are being fed with rations equal to or greater than those of German frontline soldiers. This indicates the enemy's ability to sustain multi-front warfare without weakening its domestic base. She felt a lump in her throat, not because of the turkey, but because of the truth in that report. It was a death sentence for her homeland. Greta whispered again, voice trembling. Could it be? We've believed the wrong things? This time, Frida turned and looked straight at her. Her eyes shone with pain. It's not could be, Greta. It's certain. The words hit like a cold blade. Greta choked, then lowered her head, tears spilling freely. Peterson kept writing, his eyes sad. He knew Frida's admission wasn't just a personal collapse. It marked the breaking point for the entire group of prisoners. These tears, these heavy sighs, would ripple outward like dominoes, each belief shaken, each hope of victory crumbling. Meanwhile, Patricia O'Sullivan moved around the table, pouring more gravy, offering more pie, unaware she was committing a devastating act, nourishing the enemy with generosity. But that very nonchalance was the fatal blow. It showed that for Americans, this meal wasn't special. It was just tradition. And that everyday normalcy was terrifying. Frida sat frozen, staring at her plate. It was no longer just turkey. It was a strategic map unfolding before her. The numbers she once trusted were now evidence against her country. She understood from this meal alone that she would never be the same. Inside her, a question rose, not whispered, but screaming. If the enemy can feed prisoners like this, what do we have left to hold on to? And the answer, painful and undeniable, was nothing. At that Thanksgiving feast, Frida Hartmann, the logistics officer who once believed in the might of the Reich, trembled as she accepted the truth. Germany had lost, right at the dinner table. But that was only the beginning. Because after this meal, Frida would do the unthinkable. She would pick up her pen, write a report, and send it straight to Berlin, declaring the war hopeless. Will her homeland listen, or reject everything? The answer awaits in part 2.